everyone. So we've talked about how to read lines of code. We have talked about how to read classes or files and sort of make a map of what's going on in that individual file to understand how the pieces fit together. Now we're going to figure out the final part of the puzzle, which is we have a lot of files. How do we figure out what files we care about? And I've broken this up into a separate section because usually when you're looking at an individual file, it's often not that many lines of code, maybe 100, maybe 200 or 300, but it's feasible for you to actually kind of look around and figure out how the entire file fits together. But the difference when we're talking about an entire code base is that code bases are very large. And when I say large, I mean it could be, as much as 10,000 lines of code. It could be 100,000 lines of code. It could be 1,000,000 lines of code or more, right? We don't know how many lines of code these could be. It depends on the project, but oftentimes they're really quite large. And certainly, even at the 10,000 lines of code range, most people who work on this project, certainly including you, do not know how every line of code works. They have not read every line of code. It's not just you. It's not just that you're new to this. Most people have not read every line of code in a project that has 10,000 lines of code. That's just the way it works. And so what engineers do when we're trying to come up with, when we're trying to get started on a new software project that's been around for a while and has a larger code base, what we do is we try to build up a mental model of how everything works so that we know where to get started and how to make changes. So when I'm talking about that, I mean specifically this sort of question. How is the code glued together? Because again, I can't read 10,000 lines of code. No one can. It's not like a textbook where you read every page of the textbook and then you're ready for the test. You can't read every page of this textbook. And so what we try to do is we build up these mental models. Now, another way of looking at like how is the code glued together is to look at kind of how the data flows through the code. That's kind of another way to look at it. So to give you an example, let's say that this is some code. I don't know what it does, doesn't matter. But let's say that when someone makes a request, it's a web page, right? Let's say it's a web page. Someone makes a request. What happens? Well, we can do a little bit of digging and we could find out that the request ends up getting started at this servers.js file, right? So this is number 1. And then server.js maybe goes over here to resolvers, and that's where all the, the code that actually handles that request is. And then resolvers will actually check the auth file. And then the auth file needs to check the database, and the database is over here in DI, so that's number 4. And maybe all of these things can actually call into the utilities folder, which just has like random methods that can do different things. And then separately from all of that, all of our testing happens over here. No surprise there that testing is in tests, but the rest of the stuff maybe is not so obvious, and it might take you a little while to really understand what this all does. And maybe we'll never understand what some of it does, and that's totally okay. But this is what we're going to start to build up in our head, right? This is what we're going to start to build up as a mental model for how this code base works, so that we have an idea that, oh, I'm going to need to use the authentication stuff. It's probably in the auth file. That's the sort of thing that we want to start to build up in our head. But again, we're not necessarily ever going to understand what every single file does, and that's okay. We're just going to start to build this up in our head so we start to know what's going on. So what are some techniques we can use to do that? I'm going to give you a few. One of the first and easiest techniques you can use is simply to read the README file. So pretty much every open source project has a file in the root of the project called README. And if you go to GitHub and you just scroll down on the front page of the project, it'll be, by default, it will show you this README file. And README files have information like installation. Maybe it has some configuration options. That can be in a README file. It might have information on how to contribute. Might have examples of how to run the project. And it can have so much more information. The READMEs are a great resource, and oftentimes they'll have links to other great resources. So one of the first things you should do when you figure out what issue you're assigned to is go to your project, read their README file. That'll give you a lot of context for how the project works and what's going on. I'm not saying it's going to summarize everything you need to know, but it's a good place to start. A second place to start is simply to use the project. And I say see step 1 here because if you go back to step 1, the README file usually gives you examples of how to use the project. Now, I'm not saying that you need to use the specific part of your project that you're going to be working on. I'm just saying use the project as a whole, first of all, right? Get it running, see what it does, see how it works in general. Having it running at all is going to be a really big help to you in the future, but also knowing like what's actually going on, what the project does, is really important to you. Now, if it's possible, it's also useful for you to use the specific part of the project that you're being asked to do something with. So that might be calling a specific method. If you can figure out how that method is called in other places because they want you to change something about that method, figure out how that method is called and try using that method yourself. It might mean that a page, a certain web page, something needs to be changed on that web page. Find that web page on the app and try using it. See how that web page works. That's going to be really helpful to you as well. Not going to be possible for every issue, but it's good if you can do it. It's a good starting place. Okay, so 3 is going to be to pick a specific starting point. Now, remember here I'm saying a starting point, right? A starting point. That doesn't mean it's going to be the ending point. You don't have to get this right. It's not a test. If you pick the wrong starting point, it's okay. You can go back and change later. You can pick something else. But we need to start somewhere. And the hardest part of this assignment is going to be starting. So just pick a starting place. It doesn't matter necessarily where it is. You just want to make your best guess. So we'll have an example of this. Let's say that my task is for the project Express.js, and it's to add a JSON-like support for XML. I don't necessarily know what that means. Maybe my mentor has given me some context, but maybe not. But that's okay. So let's go ahead over here and we will pull up the sample code, or sorry, the GitHub repository for Express. And let's say we've already read our README file. We've already gotten this example code running. We've already tried using it. And maybe we've looked into how JSON works, right? So we could search for Express.js JSON and find our information about how JSON works. See if we can find some sample code we can run. JSON, here we go. Any sample code? No. So we can, we'll go back here to a previous one. We'll go into here. And okay, so here's some sample code, right? So we've run our sample code. We've done all steps 1 through 3. Now we're trying to figure out where to start. Well, if we're trying to modify JSON, a good place to start is probably in JSON, right? We're probably looking for a JSON file. So maybe we go into here, we poke around through here. We don't see any files that look super relevant. Okay, so where is this JSON thing? Well, we can use the search function. So we use the search function. I find that tests are usually not very helpful. Usually I'm looking for where it's actually defined, where the method is defined or where it's being used. And so tests are not super helpful to me. Doesn't mean it won't be the case, but I always try to look at those last if I can't find anything else. So I see lib/response. Okay, this is calling JSON. Lib/request. This is a comment that says JSON. Take a look through here. We're looking through more tests. I'm going to ignore those. Examples, I'm going to ignore those for now. More tests, lib. Oh, hey, look at this. It says body parser.json. That's interesting. Okay. I don't see anything else that looks super relevant, but this body parser.json looked useful because it said JSON is equal to body parser.json. So JSON is equal to that. So maybe it comes from body parser. And we see over here that body parser is from a different project. It's from a different package. This is how you do imports in JavaScript, is this require function. So I know it's a different package. So I search here for body parser, and I get to this different project. It's a different GitHub repository, but it's still related to Express.js. I take a look in here, and oh, look at this. There's a file called JSON, right? I found my starting point. So that's kind of how we would find a starting point. And again, I just really want to emphasize, do your best. Do your best. Doesn't have to be right, just has to be your best first guess. You can always go from there. Which brings us to tip number 4. Go to definition and call stacks. So you edit your code in some sort of text editor. Hopefully you're using something like PyCharm for Python, or Visual Studio Code is another one. There's one called WebStorm, but some sort of fairly advanced text editor. You don't want to just be using Notepad for this. And the reason I say that, let me switch back over here to just the whiteboard. The reason I say that is because these have some advanced features for understanding code. So if I were to go into Visual Studio Code, let's say that this is my starting point, right? I've decided I want to start here with this new project function. But in order to really understand how to accomplish my task, I need to understand what this createDB project method does. Now I could go and I could search for it and I could probably find it somewhere, but it's going to take me a while and maybe I have to do this a bunch. Often I'll have to do this a bunch. Most IDEs that are more advanced let you right click on something You right click on something and it'll open a little pop-up menu. And one of the options in this little pop-up menu will be a thing called Go to Definition. And Go to Definition is going to open the definition for this method, and basically it'll show you the source code for this method, right? There's also one called usually go to References or Go to Uses or something like that. So if I were to right-click over here instead on the new project itself, this would oftentimes let me do something like Go to Uses. Now, another thing is what's called the call stack. Basically, when someone calls your method, the computer has to keep track of where it's going to go back to, like where it was called from. And there's actually a way that we can get that information in real time. So you probably have seen this before in a text editor. You get these line numbers, right? What you may not have seen is that most advanced what's called an IDE, an advanced text editor specifically for code, will let you click next to a number and put a little red circle here. And this red circle is going to tell the computer to pause there so that we can inspect what's going on. Now, in order to activate this pausing function, you need to click, rather than clicking the play button, there's usually a separate, it's called a debug button. Usually, not always, but usually there's a separate button you need to click on instead of the play button. And usually it looks like a little bug. And when you click on this, whenever a line of code is run that has a little red circle, it's going to pause here, and it's going to open up a little window at the bottom of your screen. It'll open up a bunch of them. One of them will show you things like variables. So if you want to know what's been passed into your function, you can take a look at that. Another one is going to be the call stack. Now, we were talking about over here in, our goal is to try to build up this mental model of how the information kind of flows through it, how the code is glued together. The call stack is actually a backwards version of that. So it'll say, oh, I came from here, right? From step 4, and then step 4 came from step 3, and step 3 came from step 2, and so on and so forth. It'll actually get you all the way back to the very start of the program, and you can actually trace all this back so you can see where things are going. So go to definition and call stack, once you really start getting into understanding what you're needing to change, can be a really helpful technique for you to find the right place in the code base to make your changes. Finally, the last tip that I have is just to make notes and ask questions. When you come up with something that you're not sure the answer to, write it down. You can ask this question later. As you get the answers to things, or as you get information from looking through the code base that you think is helpful, write it down on a separate sticky note so that you have some information about what's going on, so you can come back to it later, because you're going to forget a bunch of it before you finish this project. You're not going to be working on this 24/7. You're going to forget some things. You can also do other things that you might find helpful. So we were talking about building a mind map for the, for a class or for a file, you can do that for the project as a whole. Or you can do something like what I had done earlier, where I wrote down all the folders and just sort of drew a diagram of how the code moves between the different folders. That sort of thing can be really helpful to you as well. The biggest thing that's going to be helpful to you is to remember that as you get these questions and you're not finding answers, ask them. This is not like a test. Here, I'll switch back to just my camera just to emphasize this. This is not like a test. It's not like a class. It's not even like an exam in your class. In an exam, at least they tell you what the question is, right? You know generally what you're supposed to do, and you probably, even if you don't know the answer, you probably at least remember that it was in the textbook somewhere, right? That is not the case here. No one is expecting you to know the answer to everything, and it's really, really important that when you come up with these questions, that you ask them, and you can ask them, one, to your mentor, or two, on the actual GitHub issue itself, there's a comment feature, and you can ask on GitHub. So you can actually ask on GitHub itself. The maintainers of these projects have agreed to be nice to beginners. They are very welcoming of your questions. It doesn't mean you're going to get an answer right away, and it doesn't mean that you're not going to get an answer if your question is not well formulated. So make sure that you're asking you're thinking through your question. You're asking a fully formed question, not just how do I get started, but hey, I looked at the code here. I'm not sure if this is the right place to start. That's a better question, right? Make sure that you've actually done the work yourself, but once you've done that work and you have tried your hardest and you still don't know the answer, please feel free to ask. The most important thing to remember for any of this is just to be curious, right? The answers to these problems are not written down. People don't know how to do them already. That's kind of the point, right? They don't know how to do them. So it's important for you to be curious, go out there and try to find the answers to things yourself. If you're not sure where to go next, pick a decision. It's not laid out for you as step-by-step as a class. It's going to feel a little bit weird at first, but that's okay. You'll do well. You'll do fantastic. So thank you, and hope this helps as you get started on looking through Codebase.